So I've been thinking a lot about my brain recently, which probably gives rise to all kinds of philosophical questions. But you remember 2 years ago, not too long after we started this podcast, we did the episode on communicating with people with dementia. And we talked with Dr. Jennifer Butte, who has early onset Alzheimer's, and Louise Morse and Jordan Gross, who started the program at Northwestern for students to work with people with dementia. And we learned so much in that episode. And then 2 days after we recorded it, my mother was diagnosed with dementia. Mm-hmm. So it was a very relevant podcast at the time. And so that's what got me thinking about dementia really beyond just, running across an article here and there about brain health. But the brain really is intriguing. I mean, I'm amazed by what I can recall and what I can't. I can still remember long poems that I learned when I was maybe 4 or 5, probably as jingles from Schoolhouse Rock. But something that I should remember for work that I heard about yesterday, I don't know. It's gone.
Yeah. I remember the Sherlock Holmes version. He would always say that, he didn't remember the names of the planets because that was like too much furniture in his brain, and he needed to keep his mind palace clean. So he didn't need all that extra information. So part of me is just thinking, Holland, that some of this stuff is just superfluous. It's just extra furniture in our brains. We don't need it. But I can agree with you. I have some, mnemonic devices when I was a little kid that helped me with remembering things like the treble clef on the piano, Every Good Boy Does Fine, and Roy G. Biv, The Colors of the Rainbow. Those are great memory supports. But, I'm just kind of curious about how our brains stay fit, because, they say you are what you eat. And so if we consider that food is fuel.
So several months ago, I discovered the Mind Diet out of Rush University, and I've been following it as I sit here and look at a pie on my table, but I have more or less been following the Mind Diet for several months because I want to kick the can down the road as far as possible when it comes to brain neurological degeneration. I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
But you're good. It's all good. So you keep talking about your pie, and let's see what's going to give our brains a boost.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
So tonight we have with us Dr. Christy Tangney, Associate Dean of Health Sciences at Rush University. And I'm very excited about this because I want to find out more about this diet that I have staked my retirement on.
All right. Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. We'll see if there will be a return on investment. Also tonight, we welcome Dr. Andrew Budson. He is an author and professor of neurology at Boston University. I'm telling you what, Holland, this is going to be a fascinating conversation. I hope you remember it.
All right. Very good. So both of you have fascinating personal stories. And in just 60 seconds, would you mind sharing the Cliff Notes version of your life and who you are? And we'll start with you, Dr. Tangney.
Okay. My interest in nutrition started when I walked up and down First Avenue and looking for a job right out of college. And I walked into a lab that was part of the Rockefeller Institute, where they measured cholesterol metabolism in poop. And the lab next door was measuring adipocytes. And actually that was a wonderful setting for learning a lot about science and the role of nutrients. And that was the beginning. And from there on, I went on to get my PhD. And I've been very fortunate to work with a fantastic group of neurologists at Rush. Have probably one of the biggest brain banks, I think, in the country with David Bennett and Dennis Evans. Done a lot of work with long-term cohort studies of older adults in the Chicago and nationally as well. And fortunately worked with another colleague, and we've been studying diets in people as they age for probably the last 20, 25 years. So that's the nutshell of what I've done. I've been part of the group that helped develop the Mind Diet, and very excited about some of the research that we're doing right now. So, great.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Dr. Budson?
Yes. So thanks for having me on the program. So I was interested since in high school, trying to understand, how do the mind, the brain, and the body interact? I thought the best way to get at that would be to study it from both sides, as it were. So as a chemistry philosophy double major when I was at Haverford College in Pennsylvania. And then, when I sort of said, well, how am I going to take this to the next level? And I decided, rather than studying cells under a microscope, that I wanted to better understand people and try and help them along the way if I could. And so I went to Harvard Medical School and then did a neurology residency and then a fellowship in cognitive and behavioral neurology, the interesting parts of neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And then at the same time I was doing my clinical fellowship, I also did a research fellowship in memory under Dan Schachter at Harvard University. And from him and his lab, I learned experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And so I have combined a career where I work on treating individuals with memory disorders like Alzheimer's and other types of dementia while doing memory research both on individuals with memory problems and also people who are aging normally as well as young adults. And I'm currently the chief of cognitive and behavioral neurology at the VA Boston Healthcare System, also a professor of neurology, as you said, at Boston University School of Medicine. I'm the associate director of our Boston University Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and also a lecturer in neurology at Harvard Medical School. And the last thing I'll just say is I'm particularly pleased to be on this particular program because my current passion is writing books to help people understand memory loss, and most importantly, what to do about it. So again, pleasure to be on your program.
So excited. This is going to be a lot of fun, Holland, because not only are we getting this expertise, but we're also going to hear the stories behind some of the words, like you were saying, Holland. Sometimes we just don't understand some of the terms when we hear them thrown out. A lot of times we just get bombarded with terms. So we're going to have Christy and Andrew do a rapid fire definition round, and it doesn't matter who takes the word, but we're going to talk a little bit just to level the playing field for everyone so we kind of know what we're talking about as we're getting into this conversation. So our first word is a word it sounds like we should understand what it means, but maybe not. How about neuroplasticity? Somebody give it a go.
Oh, he's landing it on me. I would say that this is the responsiveness of our brain tissues to respond to environmental stimuli. And I would say that there are certain regions of the brain that respond by changing in that respect. So it's malleability, if you will.
I like that.
Dr. Budson, yeah?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what I think of. The only thing I'll just say to add is that we now understand that concepts like IQ are sort of outdated because we don't really think about people having like a static sort of level of their thinking and memory, that because of neuroplasticity, if one has a growth mindset and believes that they can improve and develop and get better, people actually do. And so it's just so important, this concept that, we can improve our brain. The brain is plastic. The brain is not fixed.
Exactly.
Oh, you're talking Carol Dweck language, growth mindset, fixed mindset. Love it.
Right.
All right. How about cognitive decline? That doesn't sound like a positive phrase.
Okay, I can take a start to that, and I'm sure that Dr. Budson will add something to this. So from my perspective as a clinical nutritionist, when I look at cognitive decline, it comes from the perspective of looking at certain aspects of cognition, and there are many different aspects. I mean, that's a big bundle term that includes attention, visual processing, a number of different things, language, all those things. And as we get older, especially if we're not continuing to grow certain aspects of these dimensions, they decline with time. And so they get less efficient, they get slower, et cetera. And we can graphically look at that, but people are different. Everybody comes with a different background, with a different set of risk factors, different set of exposures. So, those declines can change and they can be modified. And I am involved in two very big clinical trials, one rather regional and one national, which one of them is called US Pointer, where we're trying to modify that decline. And we're trying to do that through the best evidence that we have at this point, but translating it to the American population, which is a very diverse population, because probably the most promising evidence came from the Finnish study called US Finger. And there are at least 15 different studies across the world that are trying to mimic that and translate that information to different peoples, different cultures. And I'm part of that US Pointer. And I think it's a wonderful agenda because we're giving people strategies that help their heart as well as their brain. And they improve their physical function. I mean, there's all these wonderful aspects to it. And so that leads right into this issue of plasticity, neuroplasticity, and also modifying that decline.
Excellent. Andrew?
Nothing to add. I think Christy hit it out of the park there.
So they're very nice. All right. How about this word dementia? You mentioned it, Andrew, a little bit in your intro.
Yeah. So, people throw out this word dementia a lot. I'm not sure everyone knows what it is. So dementia is a general term that simply means that thinking and memory have deteriorated to the point that it interferes with day-to-day function. And I'll give you a little analogy as to how I explain it to patients and families. I think about the word dementia like I think about another general term like a headache. You can have a headache from a lot of different things. You can have a headache from, say, a muscle tension headache or from a migraine headache, neither of which are very serious. But you can also have a headache from a stroke or a brain tumor, which obviously are very serious. And with dementia, it's the same way. You can actually have dementia from something as treatable as a thyroid disorder or a vitamin deficiency. But you can also have dementia from a variety of different brain diseases, including Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, vascular dementia, which is dementia due to stroke, and there's many other types as well.
Anything to add to that, Christy?
When I talk to my students, largely, I talk about this big bubble, neurodegenerative diseases, and then a subset under that is dementia. And then underneath that, just as Dr. Budson talked about, and probably the most prevalent form of dementia is Alzheimer's. But, as I've learned, especially from neuropathology and my colleagues that have worked extensively in that area, nothing is ever that pure. Alzheimer's usually presents with many people with mixed pathologies. There's some vascular dementia, there's other things going on, and it's never that pure. But I think the ultimate definition of dementia is the inability or growing deterioration to function in day-to-day life, which is exactly what Dr. Budson discussed. I mean, that is the critical piece.
Sure. Wow, very good. All right, and our last word for definition tonight on name that neurological word is memory. And again, we think that this is a word everybody should know, but maybe we don't.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about this word because, I think that when we use the word memory, right, we think it means one thing, we think we understand it, but then we have situations like where, one of my patients will say, how come it is that my mother can still play the piano with tunes she learned, 70 years ago when she was a child, but she can't remember my granddaughter, my child, her granddaughter's name. Why is that? And that's because memory is not actually a single thing. So we have episodic memory, which is memory for the episodes of our life, which is dependent upon certain brain structures that I'm going to introduce because I know we're going to get into it on this podcast, which is the hippocampus. Then there's other types of memory, such as procedural memory. That's memory that allows us to do things like play piano or touch type on a keyboard or use our thumbs to pound out a text. And that uses different brain structures that are differentially affected by Alzheimer's and other brain diseases. So we now know that memory is just really complicated and it's not just a single thing. And a lot of the research that I and others are working on is to try and better understand these different types of memory. And in my laboratory, we work to try to give individuals that have mild Alzheimer's disease different types of strategies and memory aids that can actually compensate for the memory systems that are broken with memory systems that are still working.
That's powerful.
That's great.
What you got, Christy?
Well, I don't have much to add, but right away I want to ask you a question. So what do you think about Brain HQ? There's a lot of tools out there that, individuals can use potentially to enhance their brain performance. I'm going to use a very gross term in that way. And tell me what you think about many of them.
So you mean like all these brain training games that are out there?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've actually, I appreciate you asking me about that. I actually just reviewed this literature for a new book I'm writing with a colleague. And the consensus overall from not just me, but other people who are looking at this as well is, there's no doubt that if you, spend time on crossword puzzles or Sudoku or brain training games, you get better at crossword puzzles and Sudoku and brain training games. So the evidence is very strong on that. But how much does it translate? Well, if you're doing a brain training game that's actually working on teaching you how to remember people's names, yes, that will help you remember people's names in daily life. But, if you're doing a brain training game that's doing something different, it's not going to help you remember people's names. And the further you're hoping to sort of transfer the knowledge, as it gets further and further from the very specific conditions of the game, the less and less effective it is. So there's really very little evidence at all that the current brain training games can actually make a positive impact on people's lives.
The reason I asked that is, as I was talking about the U.S. Pointer trial, the three big domains that we're looking at is physical activity, diet, of which we'll talk about mind diet, and then social and cognitive activities, of which Brain HQ is used. And folks are challenged to go up multiple levels. And so they do look at different tasks in this process. But I think the problem becomes that even in finger, the engagement on the part of most individuals was extremely low. And I don't know whether that's a product of the creativity to engage people and the different challenges that are going on or what. So I don't know. I agree with you. I think because of low engagement, it's hard to really know how effective that particular aspect is working. And of course, this is a multi-domain trial, so it's even harder to tease that out, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue strongly that, you know, again, it's just not what the evidence supports. And the other thing I would argue is that it's like our brains were not constructed to play computerized games or crossword puzzles and Sudoku. And I'm sure if you put somebody into an MRI scanner and looked at their brain activation, you know, there'd be like one part of the brain that's working like really, really hard to try and do some task. But you simulate a social interaction and the whole brain is lighting up.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt, and I know you know this literature as well as I do, that study after study after study shows that engaging in social activities is so much more important. And the reason I want to make the point is, you know, I have, you know, families come to me with the very best of intentions and they say, Dr. Budson, you know, what can I do? You know, my father, you know, I'm trying to get him to work on the brain games on the computer in this windowless office that we put him in our basement. But all he wants to do is fool around with his friends on the golf course. And I'm like,
which is what he should do.
Exactly. The best thing he can do is to spend time socializing with people, you know, walking, getting exercise, playing games, you know, with other people. That's the thing he should be doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you all have absolutely segued into some of our questions, and I love this. This is why we want to have these rich, authentic conversations, Holland. You know, as an educator, some people do promote these brain training businesses. And I'm going to say businesses because I know they're out to make some money. And I know that I've had parents come back and say, you know, I took my kid to this brain thing and it did nothing. And so I'm just kind of curious because, you know, that we also hear this idea of, oh, well, this person is more left brain or this person is more right brain, that type of theory, or even with supplements that, you know, promote to be mind supplements or brain supplements. So you all have started to talk a little bit about some of this. So, you know, I would love to hear your thoughts as we explore a little bit of, you know, can we put some of this to rest? And I'm hearing from both of you, maybe some things we can put to rest and stop. I'm not going to say wasting our money and our time, but maybe there's some other things that we can be thinking about for promoting those brains. So let's first of all talk about this left brain, right brain theory, and, you know, go for it.
Okay, so you know, it is definitely true that most people, in fact, most people, whether they're left-handed or right-handed, have the left brain dominant for language and the right brain dominant for attention and sort of visuospatial functions. But having said that, when it comes to like, what should you do to sort of learn best? It turns out everyone learns the best if you can use both your left brain and your right brain. So if you want to remember something, it's good to both process the words, the language, whether they're written or oral, as well as to either see the image or to imagine the picture. And studies have actually been done, and you know, there's that old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, for memory, it's really true that pictures, in part because they are distinctive compared to words, they're much more distinctive. Pictures are much easier for people to remember. So there is questions about like learning styles, you know, are you an auditory learner? Are you a visual learner? Well, when it's actually studied, everyone learns better if in both. And if you had to choose one, everyone learns better when it's visual. I do think people have preferences, but in terms of what actually sticks, it's a little bit better if it's visual, but both is best.
And I don't have much to add to that, although I say that, as a professor in nutrition and preventive medicine, I always tell my students, give me a picture. I don't want a table. I want a picture. Make sure you have plenty of footnotes and you can describe those axes or whatever, but that's where people, when they're first exposed to new information, they're going to remember that picture. They're not going to remember that table. So, yeah, definitely. And as we veer into the supplement world, I say I started out studying vitamin E supplements in the nutrition world. And let me tell you that my feeling is nothing can be packaged in a pill that replaces a total diet that one does. If somebody is deficient, in other words, are really marginally deficient, then yes, maybe a supplement is indicated. But generally, that's been the flaw. In fact, Martha Claire Morris and I wrote an editorial in JAMA several years ago saying many of these supplement trials, they didn't even bother to check at first whether people were deficient to begin with before they initiated the supplementation trial. So the people that actually were deficient were the ones who responded potentially. And we talk about, as Dr. Budson has mentioned, there are, certain things that folks, as they age and their absorptive capacities have changed with time, that older adults need to be aware of, and not even older adults. When you hit roughly in your 50s, many people do not absorb B12 efficiently. And so that is one of the most important vitamins that we need to think about, as well as folate. But many of even the folate trials that were conducted many years ago had forgotten about B12. And it was, I remember Victor Herbert, who was a phenomenal researcher, kept pounding on this issue for a long time. So I do think supplements are indicated when people, for some reason, like there's certain groups that are totally vegan and they have very poor sources of vitamin B12. But as we age, a synthetic version is probably what's best. It's best absorbed. It also could be administered intramuscular, and that contributes to cognitive problems. It contributes to imbalances. There's a lot of issues about that, and it's often missed in the day-to-day clinical practice.
So I think Christy and I are 100% aligned on this issue. So the first thing is that, right, you need a vitamin if you're deficient in that vitamin. Otherwise, you don't. For B12, the only thing I would say, and Christy, I'm sure you're going to agree with me that the level that is the lower limit of normal in most laboratories for B12, which is around 200, is really too low for brain health. It should be around 400
exactly
as the lower limit. So, so we do check that in my patients in the clinic. And the other vitamin that has not been getting enough attention until recently is vitamin D. And there are studies that show there's a correlation between individuals that have low vitamin D are more likely to develop dementia in general and Alzheimer's in particular. We don't yet understand exactly what the pathophysiology is of that, but it has been replicated in many studies. So if you're deficient in B12 or you're deficient in vitamin D, then you should take those. But otherwise, you don't need to take them. Right. And those are just, vitamins. Now, when we get into sort of real, quote unquote, supplements, there are things that are marketed, and I'll just say, they say they're the number one best-selling memory supplement. Well, they may be the number one best-selling memory supplement. But, when my patients ask me, should I take this? I say, look, Mr. Jones, if you have a problem where you have too much money in your wallet and you need to get rid of it as fast as you can, go ahead and buy those supplements. But if you need your money, don't buy them because they don't do anything. And in fact, the Federal Trade Commission has actually fined some of these companies for false advertising.
Right. But they can't keep up. They can't keep up. That's part of the problem. They cannot keep up. And who says that any particular mix is going to provide the maximal absorption of those nutrients in that supplement mix? I mean, it is totally false advertising in most cases. And there's no real compelling evidence at this point that any particular supplement combination at least is associated with improvements in cognition or memory. At least I'm unaware of that. Now, I can't tell you.
Well, and Christy, I think you're still thinking about the vitamin supplements, but what I'm talking about are the ones made from like jellyfish and things like that, that have no scientific basis whatsoever. That's what I want people to avoid spending their money on.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, there are some quote unquote nutraceuticals that have been out there, but, they haven't stood the test of time. Let's put it that way. And so for that very reason, it is a waste of money. It's absolutely, we need to be spending our time. And I think part of the issue is it would be so nice if we could just take a pill and everything would be solved. But it really, it is what we eat and what we do is what we become. So it has to take some effort. I believe it has to take some effort. You can take joy in that effort, but it does take effort, So
you raised so many interesting points that I'd love to follow up on. So I would like to follow up on two of them in lieu of a question we were planning to ask. And the first one was, you mentioned vitamin D as something that could be connected to late life dementia. I'm 44, and the last time I went to the doctor, he did that test for vitamin D deficiency. I'm not 64, I'm not 84. I'm 44, and he did that, and then gave me prescriptions for vitamin D, which I thought was an odd thing to do. In fact, when I mentioned it to someone, he said, "So are you going to some kind of hippie doctor, or is this?" I said, "No, he's at the hospital. I just go to the local hospital. They have a family practice attached." But apparently that maybe that's something more and more people are doing. I don't know at the clinical level, is it?
I'll let you answer that first, Andy.
Sure. Yeah. So I typically tell people, depends on their levels. I want their level above 30. If their level is down in the teens, I tell them to take 2,000 international units of vitamin D3 daily. If their level's in the 20, I tell them to take 1,000 international units. But I don't give them a prescription. I just tell them to get it over the counter. And unlike B12, I think it's pretty well absorbed. So I don't even usually bother rechecking it. I usually just feel that, okay, they're doing the right thing. Christy, what do you recommend? You're really the expert on this.
I agree. Nothing more than 2,000. And I definitely agree that there is some strong associations between vitamin D and cognitive performance. I guess the big variable that is always in the background, vitamin D is also made in our skin, and exposure to sun. And this is our struggle for most older adults. They're worried about cancers, skin cancers, melanoma. I too have that in my family, so I'm very concerned about that. So I understand why a supplement might work in this, and most older adults, we want people to be checked for their vitamin D to ensure that they have adequate levels. So a simple supplement is easy to do,
Oh, thanks for sharing. The other thing I wanted to follow up a little bit on had to do with this theory of different learning styles. And I'll just throw a little story out there and ask you to react to it. Early in the pandemic, I had a client who works in education, and they wanted to create their curriculum producer. They wanted to create a podcast called Emergency Homeschooling, and they were going to talk about different elements of homeschooling and how people could teach their kids or how people could supplement public education at the kitchen table throughout the pandemic. And one of the topics he gave me to research was learning styles. So I spent a couple of hours going to different universities and looking for potential guests who were researchers in learning styles, and I was coming up with no one. All I could find were people who maybe had written an editorial or, homeschooling moms, teachers, principals. But when I was looking for real experts, they were all against the idea. So I went back to my client and I said, look, I don't think we should do learning styles because it's not apparently a real thing. And he said, we have to do it because people expect it and all the parents believe it. So what can we do that's true, but that's going to be appealing? Why do we have these concrete ideas about thinking and the brain that aren't true?
Yeah, so I would love to talk about this. So partly it has to do with the difference between what is easy and what is memorable, okay? We may find it easier to take in information in maybe the auditory medium or the visual medium. But guess what? We remember things the more effort we put into it. We don't remember things that come to us easily. And so I want to talk about a study that is done to illustrate this point, not specifically on learning styles, but about this illusion that we have that because things are easier, we remember it. So I don't know about the three of you, but when I was in high school and college and medical school, the way that I would study is I would underline my notes using one of those 4-color click pens, and I would highlight the textbook. And then before a test, I would reread my notes and reread my highlightings. So it turns out that is a poor way to study because not only does it not help the information get into my brain, but it gives me the illusion that I know it. Because when you reread the same material, it's easier to read. And it gives you this sense that you know it because you can read it easily, but that's just because you've read it before. When that highlighting and rereading method was compared to taking notes on note cards and quizzing yourself on the note cards, the quizzing on note cards won it was 30% higher retention than this highlighting and rereading. So the whole thing about learning styles, I don't know the history of it in terms of how it developed, but I think the reason it's persistent is because some people feel it's easier to learn information in one way or another. But just because it's easier to learn it doesn't mean you're more likely to retain it. It may even be the opposite.
Mm-hmm. I don't have much to add to that, but I mean, that very fact that you have the practice of retrieving that information because you're getting queried about it is what I think adds to that memory in that respect. I mean, that's the way I interpret it to me. And of course, I'm not the neuroscience that Andy is, but I do, that's the part that works for me. So a lot of times when I used to study, I did exactly what Andy talked about, but also when I started moving into rewriting those notes and making figures and then explaining it in response to somebody asking me, it's, as we know as teachers, when you have to explain it to others, you learn it, you really do. And you have to package it in a different way as opposed to how it's presented to you. And I think that's the most valuable part is repackaging it so that you can explain it to others.
Very good. I'm not sure. Andrew, did you have something else you wanted to follow up on?
No. I think Holland, we've eliminated learning styles. I'm sorry about that.
That's why you had such a tough time, Holland.
It's true, and I can't remember what we eventually found that we were able to sort of slide in there. But I mean, I remember that it was like we were caught between the truth and everybody's expectations.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this is right. So I'm writing a new book, like I said, with a colleague on this. It's not coming out until 2023. It's Oxford University Press. They're not lightning speed, but it will cover all of these types of issues. So.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Wonderful. Well, we'll definitely want to link all that to our show notes too. And I really appreciate that. I think Holland and I had this conversation about learning styles. And as an educator, one of the tools that I did have my students use, instead of giving them a flashcard with a high frequency word on it, I gave them a little piece of note card and they would have to write the high frequency word on it. And then okay, so again, there's our muscle memory because we are writing it paper pencil. Sorry, guys, I'm still going to have to go with my paper and pencil. But that I do appreciate that. And it was, just having that muscle memory attached to something and that visual memory that you're attaching it to. And I really love the idea that the harder we work, the more we remember. It's very true.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I don't know that I would call it muscle memory, but it's effort, right? It's putting in effort. It's like elbow grease, right? Maybe you want to call it, because muscle memory is usually people mean like procedural memory, right? Usually muscle memory is like how you swing a golf club or a tennis racket or something like that.
Or ride a bike. Ride a bike.
Ride a bike.
Yeah. Well, but I'm thinking of muscle memory, even writing the letter D. So if you think about it, okay, it's
sure.
Go back, up, down, D. Pull back, up, down, D. So I'm going to continue to work on that because for a lot of students, our B's and D's are really tricky. So we need to have a verbal path as well as a
visual
path and a visual to make that letter.
No, I totally agree. I think I didn't know what level, what age of students we were talking about. I'm used to teaching medical students and older students than that.
Well, we're gonna bring it back home to everybody so that we can, from cradle to grave, we're gonna have good memories here. I love that. All right. So we know we live in a country where our statistics are not really high. When it comes to health in some ways. 1 out of 3 Americans is obese. So Andrew, is there a connection between obesity and brain health? What do you know?
There's a lot of connections, and I'm looking forward to hearing Christy talk about the diet. So I'm not going to touch that, but I will just note that some of the medical reasons as to why. So obesity is often related to high blood pressure. It's related to high cholesterol and high lipids. And it is often difficult for people to exercise when they're obese. So for all these different reasons. And I'll tell you that that although you might say, well, if someone's obese and they have high cholesterol, they can just take cholesterol medicine. And well, if they're obese and they have high blood pressure, they just take blood pressure medicines. And well, if they're obese and they have diabetes produced, by the obesity, they can just take diabetes medicines. And taking those medicines are important. And I don't want to diminish that, but the studies actually show, and Christy, you probably know these better than I do, the studies actually show that you will do better and be healthier and have less dementia later on if you can control your blood pressure, your cholesterol, and your blood sugars through diet and exercise rather than all through pills.
Exactly. I mean, that's especially, and this is the big issue, is that sometimes we look at things too late in life. It is actually what we do and practice in midlife that sets the stage for a lot of this. And not to say that there isn't an opportunity to change some of that stuff, but somebody that's obese in midlife, and there's lots of studies that suggest that, the accumulation of poor blood pressure over a period of time and the accumulation of all these other additional is inflammatory. It's highly inflammatory and contributes to this whole process. And we really want to recreate that balance. And that recreation is not necessarily addressed by some of these medications because the medications are very pinpointed. I have to say that there's been a lot of evidence about statins and their roles, and they have a pleiotropic effect, but no one pill, again, is going to address all these other issues. And so, exercise is so critical for perfusion capabilities, for physical function, for cardiac function, for brain function too. And the same things with diet that we are beginning to learn. And so those things have been, because they're tougher to change, they're habits that are tougher to change, they haven't been tackled by our health industry, and I say industry because we are an industry in a way. We're a big, and what we need to do is do a better job. And I think one of the great dreams is that our clinical trial evidence that tries to promote better health behaviors has a sustainability that goes beyond the trials themselves. And that means networking in the community. That means working with other organizations, funding organizations. So that's one of the beauties of this US pointer that I'm so excited about because, we've got NIH working on multiple ancillary studies, but we have these community connections that will help foster some of these behaviors again and again, which is what we need to do. And if we can start early enough, there are lots of great trials that we're capitalizing. The great thing about computer revolution is, in a way, that we're learning how better to share data and how to capitalize on things that we've learned long ago, but to go back and look at some of them in a different way so they can maximize the effect. So, yes, I do think obesity, and the one thing that you didn't mention, Andy, is obesity also enhances the likelihood of diabetes. And it's just probably an oversight because that is one of the first trials that was done in the United States that was actually effective. It said lifestyle does better than drugs. So we did a lifestyle versus metformin, and metformin is a phenomenal drug. It's not to mitigate the role of that drug versus standard education. And hands down, lifestyle intervention prevented the development of diabetes in high-risk individuals. So that was a win-win. And we know diabetes enhances the risk for Alzheimer's disease. So all those kinds of things that we can do have great potential. How they do that, we're still learning how that actually works. And that's one of the great things about some of these big trials. We're looking structurally how things change. We're looking at markers of that, and there's been some phenomenal advancement in that area lately. Some markers that we can look at in blood, as opposed to right now in the Pointer study, we asked participants to have an MRI and 2 PET scans. That's a big ask, but it will help us understand how, as we age and how these lifestyle interventions, what is that doing to the brain, anatomically and functionally. And those are big asks. And we're very grateful that we have participants who are willing to do that.
So Christy, I bet everyone in this podcast wants to know what they should and should not be eating. So why don't you share that?
Just jump in. Okay. Well, I don't say the evidence is 100% there, but there are a number of observational studies that have suggested a Mediterranean pattern is very positive and very effective. Now, there have been 2 trials with Mediterranean diet that show that certain aspects of cognitive performance are improved and actually decline is minimized. But we have one big trial that just coming to close right now, and it's called the MIND Diet Trial. And it's actually a collaborative effort from Harvard and Rush, and we're using this MIND diet pattern. So one half of the group is actually getting the MIND pattern. Both groups are getting weight loss education. And what we hope, we've just basically had 36-month closeouts on a number of these patients, and we should see that data soon. There will also be MRIs that are done, so we'll understand a little bit more, a lot of biomarkers done. But the crux of the outcomes that we're looking at are cognitive performance neuropsych tests, which, Andy, that's going to be your domain. You're going to talk about those, right?
Because absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. We look at a battery of these in that capacity.
Let me put a time out here, because if you guys, we're going to have to wrap this up in just a little. Because we want to leave something for our listeners for part 2. So we're kind of, we're talking a little bit about, what are the positives. And I think bottom line, I'm loving the sustainability. I'm loving the community idea. I love this idea of memorable social activities that both of you were talking about. So let's hold on to some of this because we want to have something to talk about for our next episode. But Holland, jump in with our last question for this episode.
If you could tell us just one thing, one essential element we need to know to understand brain health. I realize this is a big task. What would that one thing be?
I have to say 2 things. I can't say one thing. I have to say, I actually say 3 things, but I think we need to move more and move more a lot more. I think we have to eat as green and I think we need to eat unprocessed, personally. Whole grains, beans, greens, those kinds of things, olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, and avoid, I personally think the biggest bane to our society is fast food, personally. Fast food, done. Fast food, done. We need to be away from fast food, and our food industry has to respond.
Okay, so since Christy talked about the lifestyle things, why don't I tell you about sort of how to remember better? So if you want to remember something better, make it distinctive and visualize it, okay? Those are the ways to remember things better. And to retrieve information, the most important thing to do is to relax and not get stressed if you're having trouble coming up with someone's name or something like that, because it will make it harder to retrieve the right information.
That's great advice.
Oh, I love that. I can go back to being a 10th grader, trying to remember my school locker combination and knowing that the bus is going to leave and I'm going to be left and I'm stressed out and I can't remember my locker combination, and then when you relax, it's like, okay, there it is.
See, when you're stressed, you're telling your hippocampus and the rest of your brain, be in learning, in coding mode, take in all the information. It's not a time to get information. It's a time to pay attention. You have to relax and then your brain retrieve information.
Yeah, right. I love it. And I love the Mediterranean diet. I am so excited about these positive, sustainable ideas and these essential elements. Holland, this is so good.
Right. This is a fascinating conversation. So we want to say thank you to Christy and to Andrew and everyone else. While you wait for part 2, please go to theafterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts, and tell your friends about us. And as always, you are welcome at our table.